Good evening, LifeBridge. Today we're going to be beginning a series for the Advent season. The series is titled God with Us, and we're going to be looking at 5 reasons over the next 5 weeks why God with us is so valuable. Not just during the season of Christmas, but all year round and even into eternity. Now this evening we will see that God with us means hope. Now speaking of hope, have you ever heard stories about somebody lost at sea? Now living in Nova Scotia, I would assume that we've heard many of those stories. But let me tell you about a particular one that happened in the summer of 2013. 2 longtime commercial fishermen, one by the name of John Aldrich and the other Anthony Sasinski, set out to fish from Montauk, Long Island. And as they headed out to sea, about 40 miles offshore by this point, Anthony went off to sleep below deck, while John started to get things ready for the catch that they would soon begin to haul in later on that day. He was pulling on a handle, and he was pulling with all his might when all of a sudden it snapped, and it sent him sprawling backward and right off, in fact, off the back of the boat. That might have been okay because John was a good swimmer. However, the problem was that the boat was on autopilot, so it just kept cruising away. As soon as he resurfaced from under the water, John realized the situation, and he began screaming for help, even though he knew that there was no way Anthony would be able to even hear him. So John's left behind as he watches the boat go up and over the crest of a wave and then gone. I mean, just like that. He couldn't see it anymore. And now he's completely alone, treading water in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean without a life vest, thinking this was the way he was going to die. I mean, could you imagine what that must have felt like? If there ever was or had been a hopeless situation, that has got to be it. Now, while John was trying to calm himself down and quiet his thoughts of certain death and stay afloat, he remembered that his boots were waterproof. And that gave him an idea. He took one off, he emptied it out, he dumped all the water out, and he plunged it back into the water upside down so that it created a bit of an air pocket. And it worked. It floated. So John did that with his other boot, and then he stuck both boots under his arms as flotation devices. So at least now he could stay afloat. At this point, there's now a flicker of hope. As he's floating there, he's bobbing up and down in the waves, floating to who knows where. John thought of his family and the fact that no one, anywhere, even knew that he was missing, except maybe the 2 sharks that swam about 15 feet away, but fortunately, they didn't seem to care. So he focused on setting goals, little goals at a time, and he started with the goal of just staying alive till the next morning. Now, 4 hours later, still on the boat, Anthony wakes up and he realizes John's gone. What do? Well, he immediately called the Coast Guard, who began searching procedures, even though the Coast Guard commander admitted that he didn't have much hope of finding John in so much open water. Against all odds, though, coming back to John made it alive to morning. And he's trying to keep his hope alive. But the hours keep passing and there's no sign of help. Finally, he spots a fishing buoy and he's able to reach it and climb onto it. So suddenly now he has this new surge of hope. In less than an hour, get this, less than an hour, a Coast Guard helicopter actually flew by and they spot John waving madly by now and splashing. And so they finally get to him and they pull him up to safety. We've been looking for you for 9 hours today, the Coast Guard rescue diver tells John. Well, listen, I've been looking for you for 12, John answers. Miraculously, John Aldrich survived. I mean, what an amazing story, don't you think? And an amazing hope as well. Now, if it were most of us, certainly me out there bobbing alone in the middle of the ocean, we probably would have given up hope that there was even a chance, a sliver of a chance to survive. But you know what? Hope is like that. Hope is the whisper that maybe, just maybe, these boots will float if I turn them upside down. Let me ask you a question. What is the hope in your life? Now, for some, hope is the first candle to be lit when the power goes out in the storm. Others might be hope is the first day you wake up and you can breathe again, finally, after that awful cold. Hope might be that percentage that you do have of beating that cancer. Hope is that COVID will be beat in the coming days or the weeks. Hope is the faint line on that stick when you've been struggling for days and weeks, months, and sometimes years just to get pregnant. It's the first ray of sunshine through your window after a tearful, long, difficult night. Hope is hearing the words, he's going to be okay. Hope is the flicker of maybe, just maybe. Hope is the fuel of faith and dreams, and hope is what we celebrate on this first Sunday of Advent. What's Advent? Advent is actually season of hope. The word Advent itself means coming or arrival, and the season is marked by expectation and waiting and anticipation and longing. It's a season that links the past and the present and the future. Advent offers us the opportunity to share in the ancient longing for the coming of the Messiah, to celebrate his birth and to be alert for his second coming. Advent looks back in celebration at the hope fulfilled in Jesus Christ's first coming, while at the same time looking forward in hopeful and eager anticipation to the coming of Christ's kingdom when he returns for his people. During Advent, you see, we wait for both. It's an active, assured, and hopeful waiting. Now, the Christmas season, it always seems busy, doesn't it? I mean, even with COVID lockdowns, it seems that we're busy. But in a season often marked by frenzied busyness, Advent is an opportunity to set aside some time to prepare our hearts and to help us place our focus on a far greater story than our own. It's the story of God's redeeming love for our world, the gospel. And it's a season of digging deep into the reality of what it means that God sent his Son into the world to be Emmanuel. Emmanuel is a word that means, in fact, God with us. That means then that it's a season of expectation and preparation, with an opportunity to align ourselves with God's presence more than just the hectic season of presence. So, wherever you are in your own spiritual journey, I want to invite you into this season. It's a time that allows for questions and struggle even as we take time to prepare our hearts for Christ's coming. Listen, Advent is not a celebration that God comes to fix things like from broken computers to broken families to broken and hurting lives. Yes, God does that. He fixes our lives and he's here to redeem us. But rather simply, Advent is a celebration that God comes to be with us. I mean, he is the God with us. In the darkness, in the pain, in the chaos, he comes. And he makes a way and he brings us hope. God with us means hope. For that matter, that's the way God has been working throughout history. You see, back in the beginning, in the way God intended this creation, he walked freely and openly with Adam and Eve. He was with us. And humanity enjoyed wholeness and intimacy with God. But you know the story. Adam and Eve chose sin. Separation divided God and humans. And as a result, the brokenness of our world that we know far too well is the ongoing reality. But do you realize that ever since, God has been working toward restoration and healing and wholeness for us and all he has made? This is the overarching story of the Bible. Throughout the scriptures, we can see God making a way and giving and reminding his people of the hope that he is still at work. We see it in God's covenant with Abraham when he called, back then he was called Abraham, and he said this in Genesis 12, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. When God encountered Jacob at Bethel, he renewed that covenant and reinforced the hope rooted in his faithfulness. You see it in Genesis 28. I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised you. That's pretty heavy stuff. But, there's a but here. Much time has passed. Years and generations and centuries, and we human beings are an impatient breed, aren't we? I mean, stand in line at McDonald's for more than 5 minutes and we think we're living with a bunch of barbarians. Culturally, we Canadians don't seem to understand the concept of delayed gratification, do we? We want everything now without waiting for it. Give it to me now. Which is why so many experience so much stress with credit cards maxed out and bankruptcies commonplace. Fast food delivered quickly is the norm, and we want it faster and faster and faster. So now what do? We call Uber Eats or skip the dishes so I don't even have to go out anymore. And a child in the car heading on vacation, is the absolute worst, isn't it? Listen, when we'd go on vacation as a child, I'm sure I drove my dad crazy by asking repeatedly, are we there yet? Are we there yet? But listen, church, we're not the only people in history who lived impatiently. Are we there yet was the cry of the ancient Israelite people too. From the times of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to David, Elijah, and Elisha, and Isaiah, Jeremiah, and many, many other prophets, there was a cyclical repeating of history with devotion to God one moment and neglect of God the next. There was prosperity and there was recession. There was feast and literal famine. There was pleasure and there was pain. The Hebrew people weren't much different from us. And when things got good, what did? They tended to forget about God. And then when things got bad, they cried out for God's help again. But through it all, there was a deep, ongoing longing for God to fulfill his covenant and his promise of a Messiah who would come to make everything right. And in their hearts, they would impatiently ask the question, is he here yet? Is he here yet? And this wasn't just a happy idea that drifted in and out of the Israelites' consciousness and culture. This was a deep hope. It was their deepest hope. And that sustained them and encouraged them and spurred them on, especially through thousands of years of uncertain waiting. And in the midst of that long journey of hope, the prophet Isaiah became a voice of hope. 700 years before Jesus, Isaiah gave us beautiful words that ring with hope for the coming of the Messiah. Listen to some of these. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, he said, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." And then in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 to 2, "Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned." A little later in the same chapter, Isaiah wrote this, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." Could you imagine now living in an ancient world, well before the time of TikTok or Facebook or television or YouTube, and even before written information became commonplace, and then hearing a message like that? Could you imagine the hope that would spring up in the hearts of the people? Did Isaiah understand all of these messages and promises? Now, on some level, yes, but on others, probably not. He sure didn't know God's timeline for when it would all happen and when the Messiah would come. Perhaps Isaiah thought it would be in his lifetime, or maybe he somehow knew that God's work stretched for generations and generations. But either way, Isaiah was filled with hope, and God's promises fueled him and his people to continue to hope for years and even centuries. In the story we're going to be reading from in Luke chapter 1, we see a priest named Zechariah, who would have been well acquainted with the words and the prophecies of Isaiah, and he would have most certainly held deep longings for the Messiah who had been promised. Zechariah was one of those who would have asked, "Is he here yet? Is he here yet?" That's because he had a hope for the future. Now, Zechariah was a member of the priestly order of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, and they were careful to obey all of the Lord's commandments and regulations. But sadly, the reason I'm telling you this is sadly, they had no children, no matter how good that they were. And the reason was because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were out of a hope to ever have children because they were both very old. Now, one day, Zechariah was serving God in the temple since his priestly division was on duty that week. Now, just so you understand and put it into context, there were 24 priestly divisions who would each serve in the temple only twice a year for 1 week each time. And as was the custom of the priests, a member of their order was chosen by lot to enter the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in the temple, and burn the incense. Now, apparently, that meant then that any single priest might have had only one chance in their whole lifetime to actually enter the Holy of Holies to burn incense, since only one priest was allowed in at a time. In fact, if anyone else, priest or commoner, not chosen and thus considered unworthy, were to enter the presence of the Lord, would kill them instantly. Now, in this particular case, Zechariah must have thought that he had won the lottery, because he was chosen through the casting of the lots. Casting of lots was a method used by the Jews of the Old Testament and even by the Christian disciples prior to Pentecost to determine the will of God. And what lots were, they would could be sticks with markings or stones with symbols or something similar. And they were thrown into a small area, and then the result was interpreted. Now, Proverbs actually says the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. So even though Zechariah might have thought he got the luck of the draw, it's important to remember that it was actually God who caused the lots to choose Zechariah, because God was orchestrating something amazing. Okay, so now with that context, let's take a look at the story from Luke chapter 1, and we'll read starting at verse 11. While Zechariah was in the Holy of Holies, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the incense altar. Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer. Your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John. You will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the eyes of the Lord. He must never touch wine or other alcoholic drinks. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth. And he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. He will be a man with the spirit and power of Elijah. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and he will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly." Zechariah said to the angel, "How can I be sure that this will happen? I'm an old man now, and my wife is also well beyond his years." Then the angel said, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the very presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you this good news. But now, since you didn't believe what I said, you will be silent and unable to speak until the child is born, for my words will certainly be fulfilled at the proper time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah to come out of the sanctuary, wondering why he was taking so long. When he finally did come out, he couldn't speak to them. Then they realized from his gestures and his silence that he must have seen a vision in the sanctuary. Well, clearly Zechariah was shocked when suddenly, out of the blue, God drops a mega dose of hope into his world, not just for him, but also for the people of Israel. I mean, picture it now. It's been 400 years since Israel last had a clear prophetic voice and message from God. I mean, 400 years. I mean, think about how long that is. Canada is only 153 years old. To give a more maybe accurate comparison for us, about 400 years ago, Johannes Kepler, the famous scientist, was just discovering his planetary laws. North America was still to be explored by Europeans, and Henry Hudson had just discovered Hudson Bay. In other words, a long time ago, with many lives coming and going in between, but close enough in time that things are recognizable in our knowledge. So when an angel shows up and he tells Zechariah that he would have a son who will be a man with the spirit and power of Elijah and is going to prepare the people for the coming of the Lord, we read that in verse 17, Zechariah knew the significance. He knew the prophecies of the Messiah, and he knew that this was a miraculous event all the way around. So, you see, I think we need to understand that Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were old. Too old to have kids. So that was his perspective when this happened. And this was a huge deal for them. Yeah, and the reason being was that in those times, it was shameful, especially to the women, not to be able to have kids. I mean, they would have wanted to have children. They would have tried to have children, and they would have hoped and prayed to God to bless them with children, but never happened. Even though they were well thought of, especially Zechariah as a good priest, the fact that they were childless would have been a stigma on them. In fact, kind of like an asterisk in people's minds. It would have been, conversations would have gone along the lines of, "Oh, you know Zechariah and Elizabeth, I mean, they're good people. But you know what? They never had children. Oh yeah, such a shame." You know, others might have answered with a knowing, slightly condescending tone. So when Zechariah received a special angelic delivery he has a little bit a shock reaction to it, I mean, to say the least. And he couldn't quite get over this part about him and his old wife having a child. Who, me? We're old, God. I mean, that's not possible. And as a result, Zechariah's pushback to the angelic message, God made sure that he remained literally speechless until his son, John, was born. I mean, this was certainly an inconvenience, granted, but can you imagine the hope that sprang up within this couple and the people around them when they heard this news? I mean, the old prophecies are about to be fulfilled. The one prophesied to come in the spirit of Elijah, prepare the way for the Messiah, is coming. God is moving to restore hope that he is still there, that the human expression of God with us is still coming. I mean, just the hope that God is about to stir things up and change eternity forever. There is hope in Israel. It was now alive again. Hope on earth at its deepest levels was alive again. Now, maybe some of you listening to this are thinking, that's all fine and dandy for those people thousands of years ago, but what about for us? I mean, what about for me? They weren't fighting cancer. Their spouse wasn't killed fighting in a war on the other side of the world, or didn't have a spouse that walked out on them. They didn't lose their job with no warning, with bills to pay and debt stacking up and kids expecting Christmas presents, not to mention meals on the table. And COVID wasn't even a thing back then. But listen, church, no matter what kind of problems and struggles you're facing right now, no matter what kind of season of darkness and pain you are in, let me encourage you not to abandon hope. Hope is still alive, even in our deepest pain and most hopeless of circumstances. Hope is alive because God is with us. And how can we know? How can we find that tiny spark of hope when we're on the verge of giving up? I think there are several ways that all of us can kindle and reconnect with God's hope during this Advent season, no matter what kind of circumstances we're facing. The fact is that we can have a hope based on God's Word. Part of the gift of God with us is the written Word that He's left us. These are His promises to His people, both long ago and today. They are beacons of hope. They are reminders that can penetrate into our hearts and spirits and assure us that no matter what we're facing, no matter how bleak tomorrow looks, no matter how bad the pain, God will never leave us and will never forsake us, and nothing can separate us from Him. Consider these words from Psalm 139, verses 7 to 12. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. I mean, could you just feel the hope in those words? You are not alone. God with us means that He always will be with us, and nothing can take that away. Scripture is filled with stories and words and promises that can rekindle a supernatural hope within us. As we move through Advent, let me encourage you to dig into the words of the Bible expectantly. Because God is with us, we can take hope that we are never alone and that He is always working in and among us, and that He isn't done yet with His greatest and final work of healing. The second way we can rekindle hope is to put our focus on God's character, on who He is and promises to be. You might remember about 3 Sundays ago, we read a story in Mark 5. It's a great story of hope. For 12 years, the woman in the story had been slowly bleeding to death. She was hemorrhaging daily, and no one had been able to help her. Doctors had tried, but her condition had only grown worse, possibly because of what the doctors had done, but possibly also just because of her condition. And this condition would have affected everything about her, absolutely every day of her life. Now, those of you with long-term illnesses can probably relate. But this woman was considered unclean, and she was treated in her culture as an outcast because of her health problems. But she had heard about this Jesus, the stories, the miracles and the healings, and she believed them. And because of that, hope awoke inside of her, and the hope of healing, of a new life, drove her to action. And so she did what she could just to get close enough to Jesus and to reach out. But when she did it, made all the difference in the world. And then at that time, in that place, Jesus connected with her deeply and directly and intimately as God with us. And the healing and the peace and the freedom he gave her literally changed her life and her eternity. I mean, this is our God. This is his character. Jesus is God with us, fulfilling Israel's hope for the Messiah when he arrived that first Christmas. He fulfilled humanity's hope for victory over death when he was resurrected that first Easter. And one day he will ultimately fulfill all hope and complete God's work of restoration for all creation when he returns. And this is the promise he left us to give us a foundation of confidence and boldness. He said in Matthew 28, I'm with you always to the very end of the age. I mean, this is a promise worthy to fuel our hope, church. And because God is true to his character, we can take hold of a hope in him. Finally, the third way we can find and take hold of a hope is by focusing on God's faithfulness. Let me ask you, how has God been at work in your life? I mean, you know those times when you had no doubt he was there and he was working. Maybe it's been recently or maybe it's been a long time ago, but you still remember that in those circumstances, swirling around you, the presence of God's Spirit was with you. Okay, but what does that have to do with hope? What do those memories have to do with the here and the now? Listen to these words from Jeremiah found in Lamentations. I think it's a book that most of us may not spend too much reading. It says this, "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him. To the one who seeks him, it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." I mean, did you catch that at the beginning? Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Jeremiah understood that there is hope in the future when we remember what God has done in the past. He knew that hope sparks like a fire. It flows like water. It grows like a seed. Hope grows and spreads like a living thing. It can dwindle and diminish and, even die. But with nurture and care, it can be revived and flourish and multiply. And when we focus on gratitude because of what God has done in the past, it can renew and grow our hope even today. Even during these times of COVID restrictions when many are not able to spend Christmas with loved ones, where churches aren't able to gather together physically, where jobs have been lost, even for those who have seen loved ones pass away and so only have memories of Christmas past, we still have a hope in the future, church. You see, recognizing and appreciating the good that God has shown us in the past will only increase our hope for all he will do in the future. And sharing this gratitude and hope with those who love and support us will only multiply its effects. And as we nurture this loving and living hope, it can sustain us throughout even our darkest days as we wait for God to move. Church, let me encourage you this evening by reminding all of us this season that no matter what it looks like and no matter what we're facing, know that God with us means hope. And we can hope because his word tells us we can. And we can hope because God's character promises we can. And we can hope because God's faithfulness guarantees we can. Let me leave you with these words from the Apostle Paul, where he says in Romans chapter 15, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." Have a great Advent season. Have a great week, church. You are loved.